we're very hard pressed to treat in an hour and a half, but it is worth as a way to involve you in the mysteries of this poem. It's still worth it, even if we only get to scratch the surface of a work that I find inexhaustibly rewarding. At this point, traversing it again, I find things that I've never seen before, and it just is that kind of poem. It's a masterpiece. It's something that will reward bringing back to it the experiences that we've had in our own lives, especially with this one, when we have undergone the dark night, when we have gone through desolation. That is the thing one has to bring to this poem for it to truly live for us. But even our joys, the possibilities in our lives where hope springs up, those also, I believe, have to be brought to this poem. The original epigraph wasn't the quote from the Satyricon. Pound had said he wanted something weightier. So Ezra Pound was an indispensable friend and manager for T.S. Eliot. Pound, brilliant in his own way, of course, had a very problematic end insofar as he had gone over to the dark side of the fascists in the Second World War. But at this point, he was a truly selfless maestro. He was trying to advance poetic talent, and he saw with Eliot someone who was brilliant and he wanted to help. It's so rare, frankly, you don't see that much in any field, but in literary fields, you just don't get a lot of that generosity of spirit. So Pound was really beautiful in that. And Pound also was the main editor of the poem. So eventually it would get the dedication. The wasteland would be dedicated to Il Miglior Fabbro, to the greater maker, as Eliot called him, quoting Dante. Because of Pound, almost half of the original that Eliot had in mind for the wasteland was cut. So we have a very lean version of the masterpiece, and the cuts were correctly done. So Pound was indispensable in shaping this thing, as was Eliot's first wife, Vivian, who did help in real ways. And in fact, despite the difficulty doesn't quite capture it. The marriage was a disaster for both of them, but she did always support believed in Eliot's genius, and that was a very beautiful thing. But when Eliot first presented the poem to Pound, he had an epigraph from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And this indicated, of course, that Eliot was immersed in not only classic and very ancient texts, but also he was very much up to date with the latest writing from Europe. And his epigraph was from Kurtz, at the end of the novella. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. So now, it's not the poem we've got. Eliot consented to Pound's cutting of that epigraph in place of the much more forbidding Petronius quote. I think they both are very illuminating, though, for the poem. So that, as I think there is a general narrative, as it were, of the milieu of the poem, the spiritual atmosphere of the poem is indeed the catastrophic spiritual state of Europe after the First World War. That's hard to avoid. It's also, of course, the catastrophic state of Eliot's own heart and mind during his early years of marriage. But these things are inseparable, and that's part of why the wasteland is always going to get us. It is a fusion of the most personal with the most universal. It is a fusion and with mediations along the way. It's not just the human condition, it is the European condition, it's the Christian condition, and so on. So anyway, not to belabor the point, you have the brief biography and the introduction in the book, and you've seen it on the website, so I don't want to go into that. What I do want to say is that if there are certain allusions you really want to pursue, which some of them really are very necessary, all of them are illuminating insofar as we can identify them. And you will probably be able to identify new ones that scholars haven't. That's the way great poems work. They have a resonance that even the poet isn't able to consciously encompass. But the ones that he points out in his notes, so the way you have the poem in the volume from the Great Conversation is basically the way it was presented when it was first published in October of 1922 in the Criterion, which is the magazine that Eliot founded at that moment. The first issue contained his great poem. So everything was being staked in his life on the success of a new literary journal, a quarterly, and this poem all at once. It would also come out in America in the Dial the next month, and then would be published in America the month after that. So at that point, it had the footnotes added to make it into kind of a book length. When it first was presented in the Criterion, though, there was no epigraph and there were no footnotes. So that's how you have it in the Great Conversation version. But I still think it's useful to have those voices in our heads, manage it without being overwhelmed. The main thing really is to not allow this poem to sit on the shelf because it is so difficult. It is really a very essential experience, I think, for us to go through, and it's worth it. So yes, any allusions that you want to ask about it, insofar as I've got that in my head, I'm happy to answer, and maybe others in the group will be able to help too in the sleuthing. That is also part of the fun, truth be told.
What lines resonate with you? What moods does the poem evoke? What images, motifs, and words recur in the poem? 2, how many voices do we hear in the first section? Does it make sense to think of the many voices in the poem as belonging to a single consciousness? Does the poem help us engage with the voices within our own consciousness? 3, after the triumphalist progressivism of the age of ideology, has a death instinct seized Western civilization? Does the wasteland help us understand our predicament and how to live well under these conditions? What traumas are represented in the poem? Is it relevant to understanding this poem that in mysticism, the dark night, often figured as a descent or wasteland, is spiritually fruitful? What theological themes can be traced through the sections? In enticing us to decode this modernist puzzle of a poem and frustrating our attempts, is Eliot teaching us something about how to conduct the quest for order and meaning in a humble yet life-giving mode?
Thank you very much.